Most people think Family Guy just gets away with everything. No consequences, no limits, no network ever really pushing back. But the truth is messier than that. Some jokes got buried for years. Some got a network executive personally defending a ban to the New York Times. One joke even got tangled up with a real tragedy nobody saw coming. In this video, we break down every Family Guy joke that nearly got the show canceled. Partial Terms of Endearment, Season 8, 2010. The only episode Fox has never aired there is one episode of Family Guy that has never been shown on American television. Not once. Not on Fox. Not on Adult Swim. Not on any streaming service that has ever carried the show. It sits alone in the middle of the show's history, made and finished and ready to go. And yet it has spent more than a decade locked away from the network that paid to make it. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It is the 21st and final episode of Season 8, and it was directed by Joseph Lee and written by Danny Smith. To understand why this one episode became different from every other episode the show has ever made, you have to understand what Season 8 looked like at the time. By 2010, Family Guy had already survived 2 cancellations, come back from the dead through strong DVD sales, and built a reputation for going further than almost any other show on network television. Fans expected shock. Fans expected jokes that made them wince and laugh in the same breath. What nobody expected was a full episode built around one of the most sensitive topics in the entire country, told without turning it into a punchline. That is exactly what this episode tried to do, and that is exactly why it never aired. The story follows Lois, an old friend from her college years. A woman named Naomi reaches out along with her husband Dale and asks Lois for a very big favor. They cannot have children on their own, and they ask Lois to carry a baby for them instead. This is called being a surrogate, which just means one person carries and gives birth to a baby that belongs to someone else. Lois agrees, even though Peter is not thrilled about the idea. She goes through the medical process needed to become pregnant with the couple's baby, and for a while, the episode plays out like a fairly ordinary Family Guy storyline, filled with side jokes and side characters and Peter being Peter. Then the show takes a hard turn. While Lois is pregnant, Naomi and Dale, the 2 people who were supposed to raise this baby, are killed in a car accident. Suddenly, Lois finds herself in an impossible situation. She is carrying a baby that was never meant to be hers, for parents who are no longer alive, and she has to decide what happens next. The episode does not rush past this moment, or turn it into something silly. It sits with the weight of it. Peter goes back and forth on what he thinks Lois should do, at one point supporting the idea of ending the pregnancy, then changing his mind after meeting people from the other side of the debate. Lois has to work through her own feelings without a clear answer handed to her. By the end, the show does make its choice about where the story goes, but it gets there by walking through both sides of one of the hardest arguments in American life, rather than picking a side before the episode even begins. This is where the story of the episode itself becomes almost as interesting as the story inside it. Before Family Guy ever aired this episode on television, the creative team already knew it might be too much for Fox to handle. At the San Diego Comic-Con event in 2009, months before Season 8 was set to finish, the show's producers stood in front of a crowd and made an announcement that had never happened before. They said this particular episode would not be shown on Fox at all. Instead, it would be released later as a special DVD, sold separately from the season set that fans usually bought. This means the decision to keep it off the air did not happen quietly behind closed doors after the episode was finished. It was announced publicly, ahead of time, before most fans had even seen a single frame of it. The man responsible for making that call was Kevin Riley, who was the president of Fox Entertainment at the time. About a month after the Comic-Con announcement, he sat down for an interview with the New York Times and explained his reasoning in detail. He did not argue that the episode was poorly made or badly written. In fact, he said the opposite. He said the writers had handled the subject fine. What worried him instead was timing and money. The country was in the middle of a difficult economic period in 2010, and Riley explained that many advertisers were already dealing with a rough financial climate and did not want their brand attached to a storyline this heavy. He said advertisers generally knew what kind of jokes and content came with buying airtime on Family Guy, but this topic crossed into territory that felt riskier than the usual kind of controversy the show created. In his own words to the Times, he called it an extremely fragile subject at an extremely fragile economic time, and he said the whole thing just felt like more trouble than it was worth. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important. The episode was not blocked because Fox thought it was offensive or badly made. It was blocked because of money and business risk during a shaky economy, which is a very different kind of reason than the ones behind most banned television episodes. Once Fox made its decision, something else happened that made this case even more unusual. Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network, had aired other previously blocked Family Guy content in the past. When an earlier episode ran into trouble trouble with Fox years before this one, Adult Swim eventually stepped in and gave it a home. Many people expected the same thing to happen here. It did not. Fox specifically asked Adult Swim not to air partial terms of endearment, and Adult Swim honored that request. This meant that, for the first time in the show's history, an episode was shut out completely from every regular broadcast outlet in the country. There was no backup plan, no alternate channel picked it up. It simply did not exist on American television screens. Outside of the United States, the story was completely different. The BBC picked up the episode and aired it in the United Kingdom on June 20th, 2010, right in the middle of the show's original broadcast run in America. It did not get buried in a late-night slot either. BBC Three placed it at 10:30 at night, which was its normal time slot for the show, treating it like any other episode. Around 1 million households in Britain watched it during that original airing. For British audiences, there was nothing unusual about the night at all. They watched the newest Family Guy episode the same way they always did. Meanwhile, American audiences were shut out entirely, creating a strange situation where an episode of an American show, made by American writers, about an American cultural debate was fully available in another country before American viewers could see it through any legal television option. The only way American fans could watch it was to wait for the DVD release. That release came on September 28, 2010, months after the season had already wrapped up on Fox, without this episode ever appearing. It was bundled together with a separate comedy special called Seth and Alex's Almost Live Comedy Show, which meant fans had to buy a specific package just to see the one episode that had been talked about since the year before. It never appeared on any Family Guy season box set. It was never added to Hulu. When the show eventually moved over to Disney Plus in select countries in February of 2021, every single episode of Family Guy made the transition except this one. As of the writing of this section, it remains the only episode in the show's entire run that has never been broadcast on American television and the only one left out of the show's full streaming library. Now, it is worth stepping back and asking what the actual content of the episode looked like once people finally saw it, because the reaction was not what you might expect from something this controversial. Critics who reviewed the DVD were largely positive. Cindy White, writing for IGN, gave the episode a 7 out of 10, which was a solid score by the site's standards. She admitted the episode leaned into shock value in certain places, the way most Family Guy episodes do, but she praised the writers for actually picking a side by the end instead of dodging the issue completely. She even said it was hard to believe the writing team ever expected this episode to make it to air in the first place, suggesting that even the people writing it understood how far outside the show's usual comfort zone this story was going to land. Other writers went even further in their praise. Mary Elizabeth Williams, writing for Salon, pointed out something that felt almost backwards for a show mostly known for crude jokes and cutaway gags. She noted that Family Guy, a show she considered generally silly, ended up being one of the few shows on television brave enough to even attempt this topic honestly, while shows with more serious reputations avoided it entirely. That is a strange kind of compliment for an animated comedy to receive, but it points to something real about what this episode was trying to do. It was not trying to be edgy for the sake of being edgy. It was trying to take a hard national argument and actually walk through it, using characters the audience already knew and cared about. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of the show, spoke about the band directly in an interview with the New York Times around the same time Kevin Riley gave his explanation. MacFarlane pushed back against the idea that this topic deserved different treatment than any other hot-button issue the show had already tackled. He compared it directly to episodes the show had already made about gay marriage and about the oil spill disaster that had dominated the news that same year, arguing there was nothing about this particular subject that should be treated as more dangerous or more forbidden than those. He believed the show should be allowed to talk about difficult, real-world topics the same way it always had, without one specific issue being singled out and locked away. Years later, when the show put together a special called Family Guy, 200 episodes later, MacFarlane brought the episode up again, this time comparing it to a modern version of All in the Family, the classic television show from the 1970s that was famous for using comedy to tackle serious social arguments head-on. That comparison tells you exactly how MacFarlane saw this episode inside the larger history of television. He did not see it as a shock stunt. He saw it as part of a much older tradition of comedy shows using their platform to talk about things other shows were too nervous to touch. The episode also carries a few small pieces of television history that have nothing to do with the controversy itself but are worth knowing. It was the last episode of Family Guy to be shown in the older, boxier, full-screen format before the show fully switched over to the wider widescreen picture that became standard afterward. It was also the final episode to use the original opening sequence that had been part of the show since its early seasons, before that sequence was updated. In a strange way, this means the most talked talked about, most restricted episode in the show's history, also happens to be a quiet turning point in how the show physically looked on screen, even though almost nobody watching in America at the time knew that, since almost nobody in America was watching it at all. The guest voice cast for the episode included several recognizable names, among them Gary Beach, Jackson Douglas, Phil Lamar, Will Sasso, Julia Sweeney, Will Wheaton, and Michael York. These were professional actors brought in specifically for an episode that, at the time of recording, its own creative team already suspected might never reach an American television screen. That is a strange thing to sit with. Voice actors recorded their lines, animators built out every scene, editors cut the episode together, and the entire production process ran exactly the way it would for any other episode. Even while everyone involved understood there was a real chance this particular piece of work would end up shelved before it ever aired at home. What makes this episode different from almost every other controversial moment in the show's history is the type of controversy it created. Most of the moments that get people talking about Family Guy involve a joke landing badly, a group feeling insulted, or a scene going further than audiences expected in the moment. This episode never even got the chance to create that kind of reaction inside the United States, because it was stopped before broadcast. The controversy here is not about a joke that upset people after they saw it. It is about a business decision made ahead of time, driven by economic caution during a shaky financial period, that decided a subject was simply too risky to sell advertising around, regardless of how well or fairly the show ended up treating that subject. In a strange way, this makes it one of the clearest examples in the show's history of business pressure overriding creative decisions, since even the people running the network at the time admitted the writing itself was not the problem. It is also worth noticing how this single decision still shapes the way people experience the show today, more than a decade later. Every other piece of controversial Family Guy content from this era, no matter how much backlash it caused at the time, eventually became available somewhere for people to watch normally, whether through reruns, DVDs, or streaming. This episode remains the one exception. Somebody watching the entire Family Guy library today, episode after episode in order, will hit season 8 and find a small, quiet gap where this episode should be. Unless they specifically track down the old DVD release, they will simply skip past it without ever seeing what happens, without ever knowing that an audience in Britain watched it in prime time back in 2010, while American fans were told they could not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises the question that will carry into the next part of this story. If a fully finished, professionally reviewed, mostly well-received episode about a real-world debate could be locked away entirely over financial caution during a rough economy, what happens when the reason for blocking an episode has nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with fear over how one specific group of people might react? Years before partial terms of endearment ever existed, Family Guy ran into that exact problem with a very different episode, one that sat unreleased for 4 long years for reasons that had nothing to do with advertisers or the economy, and everything to do with a joke that almost nobody who worked on the show thought was actually mean-spirited at all. Section 2, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, Season 3, 2000. Held for 4 years over anti-Semitism fears long before partial terms of endearment ever existed, Family Guy had already lived through a different kind of ban, one that had nothing to do with money or advertisers during a rough economy. This one came from fear of a single joke being misread by an entire audience, and it kept a finished episode sitting on a shelf for 4 full years before anyone in America ever saw it on Fox. The episode is called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It is the 22nd episode of Season 3, and it was meant to close out that season back in the year 2000. At that point in the show's life, Family Guy was still a very young series. It had only been on the air for a little over a year. It had already survived one brush with cancellation, and it was still trying to figure out exactly how far it could push its jokes before the network stepped in. This episode became the clearest early test of that question, and the answer the network gave was that this particular story crossed a line the show had not crossed before. The plot itself sounds almost harmless when you describe it plainly. Peter Griffin is having money trouble, the kind of ordinary financial stress that shows up throughout the entire history of the series. A man named Max Weinstein has car trouble right outside the Griffin house, and Peter, in his usual way of jumping to conclusions, becomes convinced that because Max is Jewish, he must be some kind of financial genius who can fix all of Peter's money problems. Peter chases Max down and begs him for help, and in the story, it actually works. Max helps Peter get back some money that was owed to him. This convinces Peter even further that being Jewish comes with some kind of special financial power, and he becomes so wrapped up in this idea that he decides his son Chris should convert to Judaism, believing it will somehow help Chris do better in school and in life. The idea behind the joke, according to the way the show's own writers and MacFarlane explained it afterward, was never that Peter is a bad person who hates Jewish people. The joke is built entirely around how stupid Peter is. He does not understand the difference between admiration and stereotype. He is not written as a man full of hatred. He is written as a man too dumb to realize that turning an entire group of people into a magic solution for his problems is itself a kind of insult, even when he thinks he is complimenting them. For an audience that understood satire and knew how the show worked, the joke was clearly aimed at mocking Peter's ignorance, rather than mocking Jewish people. The problem, according to the network at the time, was that not every single viewer flipping through channels would necessarily catch that difference, especially viewers seeing an unfamiliar cartoon for the first time without any background on how the show usually worked. Fox originally planned to air this episode in the year 2000, right at the natural end of season 3. Instead, at the very last moment, network executives pulled it from the schedule. This was not a small delay of a week or two while edits were made. The episode was pulled entirely and held back out of a real concern that audiences, or media watchdog groups, or religious organizations might see the episode and accuse the show of being anti-Semitic, meaning hostile or hateful toward Jewish people. Fox did not want to take that risk, especially with a show that was still fighting for its life in the ratings and did not have the kind of established audience trust that might have protected a more established series from the same kind of accusation. This decision meant the episode simply vanished from the schedule, without ever reaching American television screens in the year it was made. For 3 years, it stayed that way. Then, in November of 2003, it finally found a home, but not on Fox. It aired first on Adult Swim, the adult-oriented late-night programming block that ran on Cartoon Network. This is an important detail because it shows that the episode was not considered so dangerous that no network would ever touch it. Adult Swim was willing to air it years before Fox was, which tells you the concern was less about the actual content of the joke and more about protecting Fox's own brand and reputation at a moment when the show was still new and still vulnerable to criticism. It would take another full year after that Adult Swim airing before Fox finally aired the episode on its own network. That happened on December 10th, 2004, a full 4 years after the episode was originally supposed to air as part of season 3. 4 years is an enormous gap for a single episode of a still relatively young television show. To put it in perspective, in the time between when this episode was supposed to air and when it finally did air on Fox, the show had already been canceled once, revived through strong DVD sales and reruns, and was in the middle of building the exact kind of loyal audience that would eventually make it one of the longest-running scripted shows on American television. The episode that Fox was too nervous to air in 2000 finally reached American living rooms at a point when the show had already proven itself twice over. Seth MacFarlane has spoken about this specific episode more than once over the years, always with a mix of humor and frustration. Before one of its early airings on Adult Swim, MacFarlane introduced the episode by joking that this was the one Fox had refused to air because they believed it was simply too risky. He said this with the kind of dry humor that suggested he never fully agreed with the decision in the first place, but understood why a nervous network, still trying to protect a young show, made the call anyway. Over time, the delayed episode became something of a badge of honor for the series rather than a source of shame. Fans who followed the show closely knew about the years-long gap, and it became one of those pieces of trivia that longtime viewers like to bring up. A reminder of just how cautious even a boundary-pushing show had to be in its earliest years before it built up enough trust and success to take bigger risks without fear of losing everything. There is another piece to this story that has nothing to do with religion or stereotypes at all, and it shows a completely different kind of trouble the episode caused. Inside the episode, there is a musical parody that reworks the classic song When You Wish Upon a Star, the famous song most people associate with Disney and its opening logo. The show used this song as the basis for its own parody number, changing the words to fit the episode's storyline about Peter and his obsession with Max Weinstein. The publisher that owned the rights to the original song did not find this funny at all. They filed a lawsuit against Fox and against Family Guy directly, arguing that the parody crossed a legal line by using too much of the original song without permission. This lawsuit dragged on for years, running alongside all of the other attention this single episode had already caused. It was not finally resolved until 2009, nearly a decade after the episode was first written and animated. When the case was finally decided, Fox and Family Guy won. The courts sided with the show, ruling that what the writers had done fell within the kind of legal protection given to parody, which allows creators to poke fun at existing songs, characters, or works without needing permission first, as long as the new version is clearly making a joke about the original rather than simply copying it outright. This means one single episode of the show ended up tangled in two completely separate kinds of trouble at once. On one side, there was the years-long fear here that the episode's central joke about Judaism might be seen as hateful rather than mocking of one character's stupidity. On the other side, there was a full-blown legal battle over intellectual property that had absolutely nothing to do with religion, stereotypes, or offensive content, and everything to do with how much of a copyrighted song a comedy show is legally allowed to rework for a joke. It is worth pausing here to compare how this episode's story unfolded compared to the episode covered in the previous section. Partial terms of endearment was blocked because of a financial and business decision made by network leadership during a difficult economic period, a decision that had nothing to do with whether the episode's content was good or fair. This episode was different. The delay here came from a fear of public reaction to a joke about religion and ethnic background, a worry that a young and still fragile show might be labeled as hateful before it had built up enough goodwill with audiences to survive that kind of label. Where the earlier episode was blocked by a network executive weighing financial risk during a recession, this episode was blocked by a network worried about a very different kind of risk, the risk of being seen as intolerant at a time when the show did not yet have a strong enough reputation to defend itself against that kind of accusation. The show's own writers, including MacFarlane, have generally defended the joke over the years by pointing back to exactly who the target of the humor really is. Peter Griffin is written throughout the entire history of the series as a man who is loud, confident, and almost always wrong about everything he believes. This episode fits that same pattern perfectly. Peter does not understand basic financial planning, he does not understand nuance, and he does not understand that turning any group of people into a stereotype, even one that sounds like a compliment on the surface, is still a stereotype. The joke depends entirely on the audience understanding that Peter is the one being mocked, not the people he is stereotyping. This is a pattern that shows up again and again across the entire history of Family Guy, where Peter's ignorance is the actual punchline of a joke, even when the subject matter of that joke touches something serious or sensitive. Despite all of the caution and delay surrounding this episode, it is worth noting what did not happen here compared to some of the other controversies in the show's history. There was no organized public protest outside Fox's offices. There was no formal complaint filed with any government agency over this specific episode. There was no widespread news coverage treating this as a major national controversy while it was happening, the way there would be with some later episodes. Much of what we know about this episode's delay comes from later interviews, retrospectives, and the show's own acknowledgement of what happened, rather than from a loud public outcry happening in real time back in 2000. This tells us something important. The block on this episode came almost entirely from inside the network itself, a kind of self-imposed caution based on what Fox worried might happen if the episode aired, rather than a reaction to actual public anger after people had already seen it. This distinction matters a great deal when you think about how television networks decide what does and does not make it to air. Sometimes a network pulls an episode because audiences already saw it and reacted badly. Other times, a network pulls an episode before anyone outside the studio has seen a single frame of it, based purely on an internal guess about how people might react. This episode falls firmly into that second category. Fox never gave American audiences the chance to watch this episode and decide for themselves in the year 2000. The decision was made entirely behind closed doors, based on the network's own fear of a backlash that, as far as the historical record shows, may never have actually happened at anywhere near the scale the network worried about. When the episode finally did air, first on Adult Swim and later on Fox itself, it did not spark the kind of major religious controversy that had been feared years earlier. It became just another episode in the show's growing library, one that longtime fans knew had an unusual and delayed history, but not one that caused the kind of ongoing public fight that some other episodes in the show's history would go on to create. In many ways, this outcome supports the argument MacFarlane and the show's writers made all along, that the joke was never really about hating any group of people, but about mocking one character's endless capacity for being wrong about everything around him, including the people he claims to admire the most. Looking back at this episode now, more than 2 decades after it was originally written, it stands as an early example of just how careful a young, still unproven show had to be with certain kinds of jokes, long before it earned the kind of trust and success that let it take on much bigger and riskier subjects later in its run. By the time Family Guy reached the later seasons that would eventually produce episodes about abortion, terrorism, sexual assault, and dozens of other difficult topics, the show had already built enough of a track record and enough loyal viewers that Fox was willing to take far bigger risks than it was in the year 2000. This episode represents the show back when none of that trust had been earned yet, back when a single joke about stereotypes tied to religion was seen as dangerous enough to hold an entire finished episode off the air for 4 years. It also raises an interesting question about how audiences and networks networks judge intent versus impact. The people who made this episode clearly believed the joke was aimed at mocking ignorance, not promoting hatred. The network, worried about how the joke might land with viewers who did not share that understanding, chose caution over confidence in the writing. Both sides may have had a reasonable point. A joke can be written with entirely good intentions and still risk being misunderstood by people who do not have the full context of how a show usually operates. This tension between what a joke is trying to say and what a worried audience might hear instead becomes a theme that shows up again and again throughout the history of Family Guy, and it becomes even more important once the show moves into subjects that carry far more real-world weight than an exaggerated joke about a nervous, well-meaning stereotype. There is one more small detail worth remembering about this episode's place in the show's timeline. It happened extremely early in the show's overall run, during a period when Family Guy had not yet found the massive cult following that DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns would eventually build for it. A show without a strong audience and without a proven track record has far less room to take risks than a show that has already survived cancellation and clawed its way back through sheer popularity. This episode's 4-year delay makes far more sense once you remember that context. It was not a bold, established hit deciding to test its limits. It was a fragile, still unproven show being pulled back by a nervous network that was not yet convinced the audience would understand the joke the way the writers intended it. By the time this episode finally aired in full on Fox in December of 2004, the entire landscape around the show had changed. Family Guy was no longer the struggling series it had been in 2000. It was riding the wave of one of the most unlikely revivals in television history, driven by fans who had discovered the show through reruns and DVD box sets rather than through its original, rocky broadcast run. In that new environment, an old episode about a stereotype-driven misunderstanding barely made a ripple. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The real test of the show's confidence came later, in an episode built on a joke that also depended on the audience knowing exactly who it targeted. This time, the target was a real public figure, and her family said the show had gone too far. Section 3. The 2000 PTC letter writing campaign and the show's first cancellation. By the time Family Guy reached the middle of its second season, the show was already fighting for its life. It had only been on the air for a little over a year, and it had already been bounced around Fox's schedule more than once, moved from night to night in a way that made it almost impossible for viewers to build a habit of watching it. In the middle of all that instability, a group that had been watching the show closely from the very beginning decided the time had come to push Fox toward a decision the network was already leaning toward on its own. That group was the Parents Television Council, and the pressure campaign it launched in May of 2000 lines up almost exactly with the moment Fox pulled the plug on the show for the first time. To understand how this moment came together, it helps to look at what Season 2 actually looked like on screen and on the schedule. Family Guy had debuted in January of 1999 with a strong launch, helped by airing right after the Super Bowl, which handed the show an enormous first audience. Season 1 held onto a decent slot on Sunday nights, sitting near other Fox shows that pulled in steady numbers. Season 2 did not get that same treatment. Fox moved the show to Thursday nights, putting it up against Frasier, a long-running and very popular network sitcom that already had a loyal audience of its own. Going up against an established hit on a different network is one of the hardest positions any new show can be placed in, and Family Guy's ratings started sliding almost as soon as that move happened. Then, in the spring of 2000, the show returned again after a stretch off the air, this time landing on Tuesday nights at 8:30. This put it directly against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which at that exact moment in television history was one of the biggest hits on any network, pulling in massive audiences almost every night it aired. And Family Guy simply could not compete. During this stretch, the show came in at number 114 in the Nielsen ratings, the system used to measure how many households are tuning in to a given show on a given night. Roughly 6.3 million households watched during that particular week, a number that sounds large on its own, but looked weak compared to what other shows in similar time slots were pulling in, and especially weak compared to what Millionaire was doing in the same hour. While all of this scheduling chaos was happening, Family Guy was also drawing a very different kind of attention, one that had nothing to do with ratings numbers at all. The show's early style of humor, built heavily around cutaway jokes, exaggerated stereotypes, and jabs at just about every group imaginable, had already caught the eye of media watchdog groups almost from the very first season. In 1999, Ken Tucker, a television critic writing for Entertainment Weekly, publicly criticized the show and specifically raised concerns that some of its humor read as anti-Semitic, meaning hostile toward Jewish people. That same year, a writer named L. Brent Bozell III argued argued that a specific episode called Holy Crap promoted anti-Catholic ideas, meaning it mocked or disrespected the Catholic religion in a way he saw as harmful rather than harmless. These criticisms did not disappear quietly. They became part of a growing case, built up piece by piece over the show's first 2 seasons, that Family Guy was not simply a crude comedy pushing boundaries for laughs, but a show that specific groups believed was actively targeting religion and ethnicity in ways that crossed a line worth fighting against. The Parents Television Council had been paying attention to all of this from the very beginning. This organization describes itself as a group focused on protecting families and children from content it considers harmful or inappropriate for general television audiences, and Family Guy became one of its most consistent and frequent targets almost as soon as the show launched. Over the years that followed, the group would go on to label the show the worst television show of the week more than 40 separate times, an enormous number that shows just how often and how specifically this one show ended up in their crosshairs, compared to almost anything else airing at the time. But in May of 2000, the group did something bigger than simply publishing another critical review or another worst show ranking. They launched an organized letter-writing campaign directly targeting Fox, with one clear and simple goal in mind. They wanted the network to cancel Family Guy entirely. A letter-writing campaign like this works by encouraging large numbers of people, usually members or supporters of the organization running it, to send individual letters or messages to a company, all pushing the same specific request at the same time. The idea is that a flood of complaints arriving all at once looks far more serious to a network than a handful of scattered criticisms spread out over months. Fox found itself receiving this kind of pressure at the exact moment the show's own ratings were already struggling badly against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The Parents Television Council later described their reasoning for the campaign as tied to what they called strong advertiser resistance and low ratings following the show's return from an earlier scheduling gap. In other words, the organization argued that even the businesses paying to run commercials during the show were growing uncomfortable being associated with it, on top of the show simply not pulling in enough viewers to justify its spot on the schedule. Then, in May of 2000, right in the middle of this pressure campaign, Fox made its decision. The network announced that Family Guy was canceled, ending its run after the second season. On paper, the reason Fox gave publicly lined up with the ratings story, not directly with the letter campaign itself. The show had been struggling against tough competition for months, first against Frasier, and then against one of the biggest game show phenomena in American television history. And a network typically points to numbers like that when explaining a cancellation, rather than pointing to outside pressure from an advocacy group. It is worth being precise here, rather than assuming more than the record actually shows. The historical record does not prove that the Parents Television Council's letter campaign was the deciding factor that pushed Fox to cancel the show. What the record does show clearly is that the campaign and the cancellation happened within the same narrow window of time, during a period when the show's ratings were already at their weakest point, creating a situation where outside pressure and business reality were pointing in the exact same direction at the exact same moment. For a young show still trying to find its footing, this combination could easily have been the end of the story. Plenty of shows in television history have been canceled after a rocky second season and simply never came back, disappearing into the same pile of short-lived series that never found their audience in time. For a brief period in the spring of 2000, that looked like exactly what was about to happen to Family Guy. The show had been canceled, the letter campaign had gotten its wish, at least on the surface, and nothing in the television business at that moment suggested Fox had any particular reason to reconsider. Then something shifted. On July 24, 2000, only about 2 months after the cancellation had been announced, Fox reversed course completely. The network ordered 13 additional episodes, which became the show's third season. This kind of quick reversal is unusual in the television industry. Once a network publicly announces a cancellation, bringing a show back so soon afterward is rare, because it usually means something changed the network's mind in a very short window of time. The full internal reasoning behind Fox's reversal has never been laid out in complete detail in any single public statement, but the timing tells its own story. A network does not typically walk back a cancellation decision without some kind of new information suggesting the earlier decision might have been a mistake, whether that came from internal discussions, feedback from other parts of the business, or a fresh look at what the show might still be worth if given more room to grow. This reversal meant Family Guy got a second chance almost immediately after appearing to lose its first one. The 13 new episodes ordered that July became season 3, and the show returned to the air on November 8, 2001. Unfortunately for the series, the new season did not land in an easier spot on the schedule. Fox placed it on Thursday nights at 8 o'clock, which put the show up against two of the biggest forces in television at that specific moment, Survivor and Friends. Survivor was riding the massive wave of the reality reality television boom that was reshaping the entire industry in the early 2000s. While Friends remained one of the most watched sitcoms in the country year after year, being placed against either one of those shows alone would have been a difficult challenge for any series. Being placed against both of them at the same time, in the same hour, on the same night, made the odds even worse. Family Guy's ratings during season 3 suffered just as badly as they had during its earlier struggles, and in some ways the numbers were even more discouraging, given how strong the competition was. Fox tried shuffling the show's time slot again during this stretch, hoping a different night or a different hour might help it find a foothold, the same strategy the network had already tried and failed with during season 2. According to later reporting, these constant schedule changes ended up making the problem worse rather than better, since audiences already struggling to find the show in a stable spot became even less likely to build a regular habit of tuning in when the time and night kept shifting under them. By May of 2002, when Fox revealed its full lineup of shows for the upcoming fall season, Family Guy was nowhere on the list. The show had been canceled for a second time, and this time the ending felt far more permanent. One episode from the tail end of season 3 was left completely unaired when the cancellation hit, sitting unfinished business on the shelf in a way that mirrored, in a smaller way, what would later happen with entire episodes held back for very different reasons. It would take more than a year before that final unaired episode found its way onto television at all, eventually appearing on Adult Swim rather than on Fox itself. Looking back at this entire stretch of the show's early history, from the rating struggles of season 2 through the letter-writing campaign in May of 2000, the brief cancellation, the surprising reversal in July, and the eventual second cancellation in 2002, a clear pattern starts to appear. Family Guy spent its first 3 seasons caught between two forces pulling in the same general direction at the same time. On one side sat the pure business reality of weak ratings against extremely strong competition, night after night, no matter how many times Fox tried moving the show to a different slot. On the other side sat an organized and vocal campaign from a group that had already spent more than a year building a case against the show's content, a campaign that specifically chose the exact moment the show's ratings were weakest to push hardest for its cancellation. Neither force alone tells the whole story of what happened to the show in this period. Ratings pressure by itself does not fully explain why an advocacy group felt the need to organize a formal letter-writing campaign rather than simply continuing to publish critical reviews, the way it had been doing since 1999. And the letter-writing campaign alone does not explain why the show's numbers kept sliding against completely different competition across 3 separate seasons, since Frasier, Millionaire, Survivor, and Friends were 4 very different kinds of hit shows that had nothing to do with each other or with any organized outside pressure campaign. What the record shows most clearly is that these two forces arrived together at the same moment, creating a kind of double pressure that very few young shows managed to survive. Family Guy survived it twice, first through Fox's quick reversal in July of 2000, and later through an entirely different kind of comeback built on reruns and DVD sales after the second cancellation in 2002. It is worth remembering that this entire chapter of the show's history took place years before Family Guy became known for the specific, individually famous controversies that would define its reputation later on. There was no viral clip, no single moment from a single episode that people can point back to and say, this was the joke that nearly ended the show during this period. What nearly ended the show in 2000 and again in 2002 was a broader pattern, a slow accumulation of weak ratings against strong competition, combined with sustained criticism from a group that had already flagged the show's handling of religion and ethnicity as a serious problem worth fighting against directly, rather than simply reviewing negatively. This is also part of why the Parents Television Council's involvement in this specific chapter deserves careful, accurate framing rather than exaggeration in either direction. The organization did not single-handedly destroy the show, since Fox's own scheduling decisions and the brutal competition Family Guy faced across 3 different seasons played an enormous role in the numbers that ultimately mattered most to network executives. At the same time, dismissing the letter campaign as meaningless would ignore the simple fact that it happened at exactly the moment it did, aimed at exactly the outcome that Fox chose in that same narrow window of time. The honest picture sitting underneath all of this is one of overlapping pressure, business, and advocacy, pointing the same direction at once, rather than one single villain responsible for nearly ending the show before it ever had the chance to become the long-running series it is today. What makes this entire period even more interesting when looking back on it now is how completely it contradicts the version of Family Guy most people think of today, the one built around loud, individually famous controversies tied to specific jokes about specific real-world events or specific public figures. Nothing about the show's first cancellation involved that kind of moment. It involved a young, still unproven series slowly losing a ratings battle against much bigger competition, while a determined advocacy group pushed a coordinated letter campaign at the exact same time, all happening years before most of the show's most famous controversial episodes were ever written. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One of the specific pieces of ammunition the Parents Television Council had already been using before this campaign, and would continue to point back to for years afterward, was a particular episode from the show's early run that they believed proved their case about the show's treatment of religion far better than any general argument ever could. That episode is where this story goes next. Section 4, Holy Crap, Season 2, 1999, and the first religious content backlash before Family Guy ever became a national talking point over abortion, before it spent 4 years hiding an episode about a fictional man named Weinstein, and before an organized letter-writing campaign pushed Fox toward its first cancellation. There was a much smaller, much earlier moment that planted the seed for almost everything that came after it. That moment was a single episode from deep in Season 2, one built around a father, a son, and an unexpected visit from the head of the Catholic Church. The episode is called Holy Crap. It aired on Fox on September 30th, 1999, making it only the second episode of the show's second season and just the 9th episode of the entire series at that point. Family Guy was still brand new. It had barely finished its first partial season, and most of the country had only just started to learn who the Griffin family even was. This matters, because everything that happened around this episode took place while the show had almost no track record, no built-up trust with audiences, and no history of surviving controversy the way it would later in its run. The story of the episode centers on Peter's father, a man named Francis Griffin, voiced by the actor Charles Durning. Francis is introduced as an extremely devout, deeply strict Catholic man in his 80s, who has spent 50 years working at the same mill. At the start of the episode, Francis is forced into retirement, and instead of quietly settling into a slower pace of life, he moves in with Peter's family. This sets off a wave of tension almost immediately. Francis does not get along with Lois, and the show makes clear why. He dislikes her simply because she is Protestant rather than Catholic, treating this difference in religion as a real source of distance between them. He also causes discomfort for the Griffin children in different ways. He makes Chris feel ashamed over an ordinary bathroom moment that Francis misreads as something sinful. He makes Meg feel guilty for something as small as holding hands with a boy she likes. He tells young Stewie frightening bedtime stories about the punishments that await sinners after death. None of this is treated as evil in the show's world. It is treated as the natural result of a man raised inside an extremely strict version of his religion, a man who genuinely believes he is protecting his family by holding them to standards he was raised with himself. Peter, desperate for his father's approval the way he often is throughout the entire series, tries to find a way to make Francis proud of him. He first gets his father a job at the same toy factory where Peter works, hoping this will give them common ground. Instead, Francis turns out to be so skilled and so demanding that he quickly becomes the factory foreman and ends up firing Peter from his own job. Frustrated and hurt, Peter learns that the actual Pope is visiting the area, and he comes up with an enormous, impulsive plan. He decides to bring the Pope directly to his father, hoping that if the leader of the Catholic Church personally tells Francis what a good man Peter is, his father will finally be proud of him. Peter goes through with this plan in classic Family Guy fashion, essentially taking the Pope without permission and bringing him home. Lois is horrified when she realizes what Peter has done. Despite the chaos of the situation, the Pope ends up going along with it, eventually praising Peter directly to Francis. By the end of the episode, father and son finally reconcile, and Francis is given a new job serving as a security guard for the rest of the Pope's tour of the country. Told plainly like this, the episode reads as a story about family tension and a son's desperate need for his father's love, wrapped inside one of the more absurd premises the show ever built its plot around. There are jokes throughout that lean into exaggerated religious imagery, including a sequence where Peter imagines himself in a version of the afterlife surrounded by history's most infamous figures. There are jokes about strict religious guilt, about outdated rules, and about the gap between old-fashioned religious expectations and modern family life. None of this was unusual for the show even this early in its run. Family Guy had already built its identity around taking ordinary family situations and pushing them into strange, exaggerated territory for laughs. Not everyone watching saw it that way. A writer named Brent Bozell III published a column in 1999 laying out his concerns about the episode directly. Bozell argued that Holy Crap promoted anti-Catholic ideas, meaning he believed the episode was not simply joking around the edges of Catholic tradition, but was actively working to mock and undermine the religion itself. This criticism carries extra weight once you understand understand who Bozell was and what he had already built by the time he wrote it. Bozell was the founder of the Parents Television Council, the very same organization that would go on to launch the formal letter-writing campaign against Family Guy less than a year later. The campaign covered earlier in this story. This means the criticism of Holy Crap was not coming from some random outside voice with no connection to what happened next. It was coming directly from the person who had built the organization that would soon try to get the entire show canceled. In many ways, this episode reads today as one of the very first concrete pieces of evidence Bozell and his organization pointed back to when building their broader case against the show during its early years. A case that would eventually grow into the full letter-writing campaign covered in the previous section of this story. There is another detail about this specific episode that makes it stand apart from almost every other Family Guy episode ever made, and it has nothing to do with the plot or the jokes at all. In the show's very earliest years, before the series settled into the animation studio that would handle it for most of its long run, a different studio called Film Roman was responsible for animating the earliest episodes. Holy Crap is recorded as the only episode animated during that early Film Roman period to become the center of this kind of religious controversy. Every other early controversy involving accusations of the show mocking a specific religion or ethnic group tends to come from episodes made after the show had already switched animation studios. This one stands alone from that very first production era. A strange kind of footnote sitting inside the larger story of a young show that was still figuring out both its visual style and its comedic boundaries at the exact same time. What happened to the show's schedule immediately after this episode aired adds another layer to the story, and it requires being precise about what the historical record actually shows rather than assuming a straight line of cause and effect. After Holy Crap aired at the end of September, Family Guy was pulled from Fox's schedule. The reason given at the time, and the reason most commonly reported since, points to low ratings rather than a direct response to Bozell's specific criticism. This distinction matters. It would be inaccurate to claim that one column led directly to the show disappearing from the air, since the show's ratings during this stretch of Season 2 were already shaky, the same broader pattern of scheduling struggles that would follow the series through its first 3 seasons. What can be said accurately is that the show vanished from Fox's lineup not long after this specific episode aired, at a moment when criticism about its handling of religion was already building in public. The show did not stay off the air completely during this gap. In December of 1999, Family Guy returned for exactly one night, airing the episode Da Boom, a Y2K-themed episode built around the widespread fear at the time that computer systems around the world might fail once the calendar rolled over into the year 2000. This one-night appearance was not the start of a steady return. After that single episode aired, the show disappeared from the schedule again for several more months. It would not return in any consistent way until March of the following year, when Fox finally brought it back to finish out the rest of Season 2, moving it to Tuesday nights for the remainder of its run that year. Looking at this stretch of the show's history as a whole, a pattern starts to form that connects directly to what would happen just a few months later. Family Guy spent the back half of 1999 and the start of 2000 disappearing and reappearing on Fox's schedule in an unpredictable way, all while facing genuine public criticism over how it handled religion, coming from a writer who had already built an entire organization dedicated to fighting exactly this kind of content on television. By May of 2000, that same organization would formally launch its letter-writing campaign, asking Fox to cancel the show outright, arriving at almost the exact moment the show's ratings had become impossible to ignore. Holy Crap sits right at the beginning of that timeline, a small, strange, mostly well-reviewed episode about a father and son that ended up becoming one of the earliest specific pieces of ammunition in a fight that would nearly end the entire show within its first 2 years on the air. It is worth being fair to the episode itself here, because the criticism it received does not fully match how most people who actually watched it responded at the time or in the years since. Reviews of the episode over the years have generally landed as positive, with viewers often pointing to the scenes involving the Pope as some of the strongest material in the episode, and many describing Francis Griffin as one of the more memorable side characters introduced during the show's early seasons. Charles Durning's performance as Francis is frequently singled out as a highlight, giving the character a gruff, believable weight that made his eventual reconciliation with Peter feel earned rather than rushed. None of this erases the specific concern Bozell raised, but it does show that the reaction to this episode was never simple or one-sided. Plenty of viewers, including many who identified strongly with their own religious backgrounds, watched the same episode and came away seeing a story about a strained father-son relationship rather than an attack on their faith. This tension between how an episode is intended and how it gets gets read by different audiences is a thread that runs through nearly every controversy in this show's history, and holy crap is where that thread first becomes visible in a documented, public way. The writers built a story about a difficult, old-fashioned father clashing with his modern family, using his religion as the clearest way to show how out of step he was with the people around him. One prominent critic looked at that same story and saw something aimed squarely at the religion itself rather than at one specific character's rigid version of it. Both readings came from watching the exact same 22 minutes of television. Neither side was working from different information. They simply weighed the same jokes and the same scenes differently, based on what they were already primed to look for. Years later, the Parents Television Council would return to this same broader argument in a much larger and more detailed way. In 2006, the organization published a report called Faith in a Box, focused entirely on how entertainment television handled religion across many different shows, not just Family Guy. This report continued to raise concerns about how the series portrayed God, Jesus, and organized religion more broadly, showing that the concern first raised around holy crap in 1999 never fully went away. It simply grew over the following years into a much larger, more organized argument, built episode by episode, criticism by criticism, until it became one of the central pillars of the case the organization continued to make against the show for years afterward. What makes holy crap worth understanding on its own, separate from everything that came after it, is how small and personal the story at its center actually is, compared to the scale of the reaction it helped set in motion. This is not an episode about a national political debate. It is not built around a real-world tragedy or a specific living public figure. It is a story about an elderly father who does not know how to show love the way his son needs him to, wrapped inside one of the strangest plot devices the show has ever used to solve that problem. And yet this small, mostly personal story became one of the very first data points in a fight over the show's future that would nearly end it entirely within its first 2 years. A fight that connects in a straight line to the letter-writing campaign and near cancellation covered just before this section. There is a strange kind of irony sitting underneath all of this once you step back and look at the full shape of the story. The same organization that would spend the next 2 decades building an enormous case against Family Guy, filing formal complaints, publishing yearly worst show lists, and organizing direct pressure campaigns against the network, first built part of that case around an episode where the show's own writers were clearly trying to tell a story about love, disappointment, and the messy relationship between a father and son. The religious jokes inside the episode were real, and some of them were sharp enough to genuinely upset people who took them seriously. But the emotional center of the episode was never really about mocking anyone's faith. It was about a son trying desperately to be seen by his father, using the biggest, most absurd gesture he could think of to make that happen. This gap between what a story is trying to say and what specific audiences hear instead becomes one of the most important threads running through the entire history of this show's controversies. It showed up here, in one of the earliest episodes the series ever made, long before anyone involved with the show could have known just how often this exact same pattern would repeat itself over the next 2 decades, across dozens of episodes, dozens of controversies, and dozens of arguments over where a joke actually points and who it is actually aimed at. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same gap between intention and reaction would eventually explode in a much bigger, much louder way years later. Not over a fictional father and son, but over a real cutaway gag involving a real disease, a group of real organizations built specifically to help people living with it, and a wave of public anger that arrived almost the moment the episode finished airing. Section 5. The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire, Season 4, 2005. The AIDS musical number. Not every controversy in this show's history comes from a joke about a stereotype, a religion, or a political debate. Some of the loudest reactions in the show's whole run have come from a single short scene buried inside an episode that was mostly about something else entirely. That is exactly what happened with an episode from Season 4, built around a marriage falling apart, an affair nobody saw coming, and a musical cutaway that turned a very serious medical condition into a lighthearted song and dance number. The episode is called The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire. It aired on Fox on June 12, 2005, as the 5th episode of Season 4, written by Mike Henry along with his brother Patrick Henry, and directed by James Purdom, who had previously worked as a director on the animated show Futurama before joining the Family Guy team. This episode carries real weight in the show's overall history beyond the controversy it caused, because it marks the final regular appearance of Loretta, the wife of Cleveland Brown, one of Peter's closest friends in the neighborhood. According to the episode's own DVD commentary, Loretta was written out of the show at this point because Alex Borstein, the actress who voices her, along with Lois Griffin and several other female female characters, had grown tired of performing the voice and had originally expected Loretta to appear only once when she was first introduced years earlier. This episode gave the writers a reason to remove her from regular episodes, and it laid much of the groundwork for events that would eventually lead into the spin-off series called The Cleveland Show years later. The main story follows a boat trip. Peter invites his usual group of friends out on his fishing boat for a get-together at sea. While everyone is enjoying themselves, Glenn Quagmire is out fishing when he reels in a catch that lands directly between Loretta's chest. Rather than being upset, Loretta invites him to reach in and retrieve it himself. After a moment of clear hesitation, Quagmire does exactly that. At almost the same moment, Cleveland walks past the two of them, completely unaware of what is happening, calmly mentioning the snacks that Peter has brought along for the trip before continuing on his way. This single moment sets the entire rest of the episode's plot into motion, though nobody watching yet realizes how far the consequences are about to spread. Later, back at the Brown house, Peter and Brian hear Loretta screaming from inside and rush over to check on her, only to discover she is having sex with another man on the living room couch. They do not immediately realize who the man is, since they can only see the back of his body, along with a very specific detail that will matter later, a tattoo of a phone number located on his backside. Rather than keeping quiet about what they witnessed, Peter and Brian immediately begin telling everyone they run into about Loretta's affair, spreading the news through the neighborhood with the same lack of tact that defines almost everything Peter does throughout the entire show. Eventually, Peter decides to tell Cleveland directly, doing so at their usual hangout spot, the Drunken Clam, in an especially blunt and clumsy way. Cleveland's reaction in the moment is oddly calm and distant, which becomes its own running joke throughout the rest of the episode, since Cleveland is consistently written as one of the most laid-back and emotionally low-key characters in the entire cast. The identity of the man Loretta slept with is eventually revealed once Peter and Brian go to Quagmire's house looking for help tracking down the culprit, only to notice the exact same tattoo they saw during the affair, now visible on Quagmire himself. Despite this discovery, and despite everyone around him now knowing exactly what happened, Cleveland continues to react with almost no visible emotion at all, prompting Lois to step in and explain to him that sometimes a woman wants to see her husband show real passion and stand up for himself, rather than remaining passive no matter what happens around him. Peter takes this advice as a personal mission, dragging Cleveland along to a wrestling event featuring the real-life wrestler Randy Savage, hoping the atmosphere of aggression and competition will help Cleveland finally access some anger of his own. When that plan does not fully work, Peter goes even further, putting on a mask designed to look like Quagmire and forcing Brian to wear a mask designed to look like Loretta, then wrestling with him on the ground in front of Cleveland in an attempt to provoke a real reaction. This finally succeeds. Cleveland becomes genuinely angry for the first time in the entire episode and vows to confront Quagmire directly. Realizing his plan has worked a little too well, Peter suddenly finds himself trying to protect Quagmire instead, hiding him away at a friend's mansion to keep him safe from Cleveland's anger. By the end of the episode, Cleveland and Quagmire agree to settle their broken friendship the way many arguments get settled throughout this show's history, through a lighthearted boxing match between the two of them. Taken purely as a plot, this episode fits comfortably alongside dozens of other Family Guy storylines built around marriage problems, misplaced loyalty, and Peter's complete inability to handle sensitive information responsibly. None of what happens in the main story around Cleveland, Loretta, and Quagmire caused any real public controversy on its own. The backlash this episode became known for came instead from a short cutaway gag that had almost nothing to do with the main plot at all. The scene happens early in the episode, right after Peter tells Lois that he has a special knack for delivering bad news to people gently. To prove his point, the show cuts away to a flashback showing Peter inside a hospital room, standing beside a patient's bed. Peter tells the patient he does not quite know how to say what needs to be said, and instead of finishing the sentence himself, he steps aside and lets a group of men dressed as an old-fashioned barbershop quartet take over. The men begin singing directly to the patient, informing him through an upbeat, old-timey musical number that he has been diagnosed with AIDS. The song continues for several lines, walking through possible ways the man might have contracted the illness, all delivered in the same cheerful, old-fashioned singing style, typically associated with lighthearted, nostalgic entertainment rather than serious medical news. The entire scene lasts only a short amount of time before the episode cuts back to the main story, moving on as though nothing unusual had just happened. This short scene became the single most talked about moment in the entire episode almost immediately after it aired. AIDS is a serious, life-threatening illness that has affected millions of people around the world, and by 2005, entire organizations existed specifically to support people living with the condition, to fund medical research, and to fight the kind of stigma and misunderstanding misunderstanding that had surrounded the illness since it first became widely known in the 1980s, turning a diagnosis this serious into an upbeat musical joke, delivered through a format usually associated with cheerful, old-fashioned entertainment, struck many viewers as an especially harsh and tone-deaf choice. Even by the standards of a show already known for pushing boundaries in almost every episode, the reaction arrived quickly. According to reporting at the time, including coverage from the entertainment outlet The Advocate, groups working specifically to support people affected by AIDS were not amused by the scene, a reaction described directly in an article published in August of 2005 that specifically discussed how the show had chosen to handle the subject. This response ties directly into a broader pattern documented in a book published the following year by author Frederick S. Lane, titled The Decency Wars: The Campaign to Cleanse American Culture. In that book, Lane specifically points to this episode and its handling of AIDS as one of several examples he uses to describe Family Guy as a show aimed squarely at the darker, more uncomfortable corners of everyday family life, rather than the gentler, more traditional style of family comedy audiences were used to seeing on network television up to that point. The airing of this episode led to real, organized backlash from multiple AIDS service organizations, who saw the joke not as harmless exaggeration, but as something that made light of a disease that had already caused enormous suffering and loss for countless real families. It helps to understand exactly why a joke like this lands so differently depending on who is watching it. For a viewer with no personal connection to the illness, the scene might register simply as one more example of the show's willingness to joke about absolutely anything, no different in spirit from jokes the show has made about death, disability, or any number of other serious topics played for shock value throughout its history. For someone who had lost a friend, a partner, or a family member to AIDS, or for someone working every day inside an organization built specifically to help people survive and manage the illness with dignity, the same 3 or 4 minutes of screen time can feel like something very different. It can feel like a serious, painful chapter of their own life, or the lives of people they have devoted their careers to helping, being turned into an easy punchline for a national television audience without a second thought. This gap between how a joke is intended inside a writer's room and how it lands for people directly affected by the subject matter is a pattern that has already shown up more than once in this story. First with the earlier episode about religion and a father's strict expectations, and now again here in a completely different context involving a serious illness. The writers of this scene almost certainly built it around the contrast between the cheerful, old-fashioned style of the barbershop quartet performance and the seriousness of the news being delivered, using that clash of tone as the entire engine of the joke. For AIDS service organizations, already working daily to fight public misunderstanding and stigma around the illness, that same clash of tone likely read less like clever contrast and more like the show treating a genuine tragedy as pure comedy, without any real weight attached to it at all. It is worth being precise here about what did and did not happen in response to this specific episode, since not every controversy in the show's history led to the same kind of consequences. Unlike some of the episodes covered earlier in this story, there is no record of Fox pulling this episode from broadcast, no record of it being blocked from DVD release, and no record of a formal government complaint being filed specifically over this scene the way there would be with other episodes later in the show's run. The episode continued airing normally, was eventually included on streaming platforms once the show's full catalog became available on Hulu following the Disney acquisition of Fox years later, and remains part of the show's regular library today. The consequence here was not a ban or a network decision. It was public backlash, organized specifically by groups representing people directly affected by the illness being joked about, arriving in the days and weeks immediately following the broadcast. The episode itself received a generally positive response from critics at the time, separate from the specific controversy surrounding the AIDS scene. Kim Voinar, writing for the entertainment site TV Squad, gave the episode a favorable review, describing it as packed full of the kind of tasteless and tacky moments that had already become the show's calling card by this point in its run. This kind of review captures something important about how audiences and critics often separated their reaction to the show's general style from their reaction to any one specific joke that crossed into more sensitive territory. Being tasteless was, by this point, already priced into what people expected from Family Guy. The AIDS scene managed to stand out as crossing a further line specifically because of who it affected and how directly it touched a subject that, for a significant number of real people watching, was not distant or abstract at all. The episode also performed strongly in terms of raw viewership. It reached 8.35 million total viewers, a solid number that helped push Fox into second place that night among adults between 18 and 49 years old, one of the most closely watched age groups in all of television advertising. This detail matters because it shows that whatever backlash backlash the AIDS scene generated did not translate into any kind of mass rejection of the episode by the general viewing audience. The show continued growing its audience through this exact period of its run, the same stretch of years that had already seen it revived from cancellation and rebuilt into one of the most talked-about comedies on network television, driven heavily by DVD sales and reruns on Adult Swim. Taken together, this episode tells a slightly different kind of story than the ones covered earlier. It was not blocked by a nervous network worried about advertisers. It was not held back for years out of fear of how one specific joke might be misread. It aired exactly as written, reached a large audience, and became a commercial success by the standards of the time, while simultaneously drawing real, organized anger from groups representing people whose lives had been shaped directly by the illness being turned into a cheerful musical punchline. This is its own specific kind of controversy, one built entirely on public reaction after the fact rather than network caution before broadcast, and it shows a different side of how this show's willingness to joke about absolutely anything played out in the real world. There is also something worth noticing about where this particular joke sits inside the larger structure of the episode itself. The AIDS cutaway has almost nothing to do with the main plot involving Cleveland, Loretta, and Quagmire. It exists purely as a quick side joke, used only to demonstrate that Peter believes he has a gentle way of sharing difficult news with people, a claim the show then immediately undercuts by showing exactly how strange and unhelpful his version of gentle delivery actually is. This is a pattern that shows up constantly throughout the entire history of the series. Some of the show's most talked about and most controversial moments are not the central storylines audiences remember an episode for, but brief, almost disposable cutaway jokes dropped in for only a few seconds before the show moves on entirely. The main plot of this specific episode, involving a broken marriage and two best friends trying to repair their friendship through a boxing match, barely gets remembered at all compared to the 3 or 4 lines of a musical number about a serious illness, tucked into the opening minutes almost as an afterthought. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This pattern of controversy growing out of small, easily missed cutaway jokes, rather than the central plot of an episode, becomes especially important going forward, because the very next major controversy in this story follows the exact same shape, except this time, the target was not a general illness affecting the public at large. It was one specific, real, living person, and the family member she believed the show had gone out of its way to mock. Section 6, Extra Large Medium, Season 8, 2010. Sarah Palin, Trig, and the Down syndrome joke. Every controversy covered so far in this story has grown out of a network decision, an advocacy group's campaign, or public anger from an entire community responding to a joke. This next one is different. It became one of the loudest fights in the show's entire history because one specific, real, and very famous woman decided that a single line of dialogue was a personal attack on her family, and she said so directly, in public, within a day of the episode airing. The episode is called Extra Large Medium. It aired on Fox on February 14, 2010, which happened to be Valentine's Day. Directed by John Holmquist and written by Steve Callahan, who was serving as the show's showrunner at the time. The episode carries 2 separate storylines running side by side, which was a common structure for the show by this point in its run. In one storyline, Peter becomes convinced he has developed extrasensory perception, often shortened to ESP, which is the idea that a person can sense or know things without using any of the normal 5 senses. This belief comes after Chris and Stewie go missing during a family hike in the woods and are eventually found safe. Peter, shaken by the experience, starts believing he has been given a kind of psychic gift, and he spends much of the episode performing readings for other characters before the show reveals that he has been faking the whole thing, something the local police eventually figure out for themselves. The second storyline follows Chris. While he and Stewie were lost in the woods together, Chris makes a promise that once they are found safe, he will finally work up the courage to ask out a girl from his school named Ellen, someone he has feelings for but has been too nervous to approach directly. Ellen has Down syndrome, a genetic condition that affects physical and intellectual development. After the family is rescued, Chris keeps his promise and gets ready for the date, with Stewie helping him prepare through an extended, elaborate musical number meant to build his confidence. Once the date actually happens, things do not go the way Chris expected. Ellen turns out to be rude, demanding, and difficult throughout their time together, and by the end of the date, Chris admits that he had gone in expecting her to act a certain way simply because of her condition, realizing partway through that he had built his entire idea of her around a stereotype rather than getting to know her as an actual person. Ellen ultimately ends the relationship herself, telling Chris to leave. Stewie later comforts him, telling him he should still feel proud of himself for working up the courage to ask her out in the first place, even though things did not work out the way he hoped. Inside this story storyline sits the single line of dialogue that would end up defining the entire episode's public reputation. Early in their date, Chris asks Ellen what her parents do for a living. Ellen responds that her father is an accountant and that her mother is the former governor of Alaska. The show never says the name Sarah Palin directly anywhere in the episode. It does not need to. By February of 2010, Sarah Palin was one of the most recognizable political figures in the entire country, having served as the actual governor of Alaska before becoming the Republican Party's nominee for vice president in 2008. She was also, and this detail matters enormously here, the mother of a son named Trig, who was born with Down syndrome. The moment Ellen mentions her mother being the former governor of Alaska, any viewer with even a passing knowledge of recent American politics would immediately understand exactly who the joke was pointing toward, even without a single direct mention of Palin's actual name. The reaction did not take long to arrive. Sarah Palin responded publicly within a day of the episode airing, posting a statement on Facebook that framed the joke as something painful and deeply personal, directed specifically at her family and her son. Her daughter Bristol Palin also responded publicly around the same time, posting her own statement questioning whether there were any limits at all to what people were willing to say about her younger brother or about other members of the special needs community, and arguing that the writers behind the joke had proven themselves to be cold and uncaring rather than clever. Sarah Palin took her criticism even further a short time later, appearing on the Fox News program The O'Reilly Factor, where she described the people responsible for the episode as cruel and cold-hearted, and she raised a broader question about whether there should be limits on what kinds of subjects are considered acceptable for comedy at all. This put Family Guy at the center of a very public argument involving one of the most talked-about political figures in the entire country, playing out across news programs, entertainment outlets, and eventually newspaper interviews over the following days and weeks. Almost every major entertainment news outlet at the time picked up the story, treating it as a genuine national controversy rather than the usual kind of niche complaint the show typically drew from smaller advocacy groups. This was a different scale of attention entirely compared to almost everything covered earlier in this story. What makes this particular controversy stand apart from most others in the show's history is what happened next, because the most powerful response to Sarah Palin's criticism did not come from Seth MacFarlane, from Fox, or from the show's writing staff at all. It came from the actress who had voiced Ellen in the episode. Her name is Andrea Faye Friedman, and she herself was born with Down syndrome, making her one of the very few actors in the show's entire history whose real-life experience directly overlapped with the character she was playing. Friedman had built a respected acting career well before this episode, including earlier roles in shows like Life Goes On and Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, along with a film called Smudge that had won a humanitarian award years earlier. Shortly after Sarah Palin's public criticism, Friedman sent a written statement directly to the New York Times and to other media outlets, responding to the Palin family's reaction in her own words. She stated plainly that she believed former Governor Palin simply did not have a sense of humor. She explained that she found the specific line about her mother being the former governor of Alaska genuinely funny, describing it clearly as a joke built on sarcasm rather than cruelty. She went further, explaining that the joke inside the episode had been aimed at mocking Sarah Palin herself, not at mocking people who have Down syndrome, and she pointed out that her own family had always believed that laughing and having a sense of humor about life was a healthy and important thing. She also directly addressed the idea that Palin often positioned herself publicly as a devoted advocate for children and families dealing with Down syndrome, suggesting in her statement that Palin's public use of her son's condition for sympathy and political support was itself worth examining honestly, rather than treating any joke connected to her as automatically off-limits. In a later interview with ABC News, Friedman added that she wished Palin would simply loosen up and enjoy a laugh once in a while, repeating her belief that Palin had missed the actual point of the joke entirely. This response mattered enormously to how the controversy played out in public. Instead of a simple story about a comedy show mocking a vulnerable group of people, the actual center of the disagreement became a much more complicated argument between two very different perspectives, both of which carried real weight and credibility. On one side stood a mother speaking from personal experience raising a child with Down syndrome, expressing genuine hurt over content she believed crossed a painful line. On the other side stood an actress who had lived her entire life with the exact same condition, someone with just as much personal authority to speak on the subject, arguing that the joke had never been about her or people like her at all, and that the backlash itself misunderstood who the humor was actually targeting. Steve Callahan, the writer behind the episode, addressed the growing controversy directly a few months later during a panel at the San Diego Comic-Con event held in July of 2010. Speaking about the direction the the show was taking heading into its 9th season. Callahan referenced Palin's criticism specifically, saying that this time around, he had decided to write something that would go out of its way to offend smart people instead. This comment reflected a broader argument that Seth MacFarlane and much of the writing staff had been making publicly for years. The idea that the show intentionally avoided picking easy or predictable targets, aiming instead for material that challenged assumptions across the entire political spectrum rather than favoring one particular side. MacFarlane himself responded to the controversy directly in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, defending the episode by pointing back to the show's long-standing approach to satire. He explained that Family Guy had always built its humor around being what he called an equal opportunity offender, meaning the show aimed to mock people and ideas across every possible group, background, and belief system, rather than singling out any one target as being safe from criticism while attacking everyone else. This defense echoes almost exactly the argument MacFarlane made years earlier regarding the abortion-focused episode covered in an earlier section of this story, where he compared that episode's subject matter directly to other hot-button issues the show had already tackled without facing the same level of institutional pushback. The pattern across both defenses is consistent. MacFarlane's position has remained the same across very different controversies, arguing that no single sensitive topic deserves special protection from the show's humor if the show is going to remain honest about its approach to satire across every other subject it covers. Additional public support for the episode came from television host Bill Maher, who spoke in favor of MacFarlane's handling of the situation on his own program, Real Time. This added another layer to the public conversation, positioning support for the episode as coming not just from inside the show's own creative team, but from other prominent entertainment figures who agreed that the joke had been misunderstood or unfairly criticized. Despite the strength of the public argument coming from both Palin and Friedman, the Parents Television Council also weighed in during the episode's original broadcast, adding its own criticism to the growing pile of reactions. This detail is worth noting carefully because it shows the episode drew concern not only from Palin's personal, politically charged objection, but also from a long-standing advocacy group that had already spent more than a decade building a broader case against the show's content on separate grounds entirely, tracing all the way back to the same organization discussed earlier in this story regarding the show's very first near cancellation in the year 2000. What is easy to lose inside the noise of this entire controversy is how the episode was actually received once critics and audiences sat down and watched the whole thing, rather than reacting only to a single line pulled out of context. Overall critical response to Extra-Large Medium leaned mostly positive. Reviewers praised the storyline built around Chris and Ellen specifically, along with the episode's many cultural references and its overall portrayal of a character living with Down syndrome. One television critic writing for the site TV Squad specifically praised a joke inside the episode referencing the classic comedy duo Abbott and Costello, calling it especially well placed, and described the episode's overall handling of the Down syndrome storyline as refreshing rather than mean-spirited. This critical reaction suggests that, taken as a whole, much of the episode's actual writing around Ellen's character was seen by many viewers as thoughtful rather than cruel, even while the single, specific joke referencing Palin's family became the only part of the episode most of the country ever actually talked about. The episode also performed strongly with audiences in terms of raw viewership, reaching 6.42 million households according to Nielsen ratings during its original broadcast. This means the controversy did not appear to hurt the show's popularity in any measurable way during this period, echoing the exact same pattern seen with the AIDS-related controversy covered earlier in this story, where public backlash and strong viewership numbers ended up existing at the exact same time rather than working against each other. There is one more piece of this story that adds an unusual, almost celebratory twist to an episode otherwise remembered mainly for controversy. The original song performed during Chris and Ellen's date preparation, titled Down Syndrome Girl, received a nomination for a Primetime Emmy Award in the category of Outstanding Original Music and Lyrics. Seth MacFarlane and composer Walter Murphy were both nominated together for their work writing the song. On July 24, 2010, the same day Steve Callahan addressed the controversy directly during the Comic-Con panel, MacFarlane performed the song live in front of an audience of roughly 4,200 people. At the actual Creative Arts Emmy ceremony held on August 21, 2010, the song ultimately lost in its category to a song from the USA Network series Monk, but the nomination itself remains a real, documented piece of this episode's history, existing alongside everything else that happened around it. It is a strange but true detail sitting right beside the political controversy, showing that the same piece of music at the center of Sarah Palin's criticism was was, at nearly the exact same time, being recognized by the television industry's own award system as a genuinely well-crafted piece of comedic songwriting. Taken as a whole, this controversy differs from every other one covered so far in this story in one very specific way. It is the only episode in this list where the central disagreement plays out directly between two real people speaking from deeply personal experience, rather than between the show and a network executive, an advocacy organization, or an entire community responding collectively. Sarah Palin spoke as a mother defending her son. Andrea Faye Friedman spoke as a woman who had lived her entire life with the exact same condition Ellen's character represented on screen. Both had a genuine, personal stake in how this joke should be understood, and both reached completely different conclusions about where the humor was actually pointed. Nothing about this makes the disagreement simple, and nothing about it offers an easy answer for who was ultimately right. What the historical record shows clearly is that this episode created one of the most personal, most publicly argued controversies in the entire history of the show, precisely because it pulled a real, still-living public figure directly into its comedy, using a level of specificity the show had rarely attempted before. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That willingness to point directly at a real person rather than a general topic or a fictional stand-in would eventually lead the show into far more serious territory just a few years later, when a single cutaway gag, originally written purely as dark comedy, ended up colliding with an actual real-world tragedy that unfolded almost exactly 1 month after the episode containing it had already aired. Section 7, Turban Cowboy, Season 11, 2013. Pulled after the Boston Marathon bombing. Every controversy covered so far in this story came from something the writers put into an episode on purpose, a joke built with a specific target already in mind before a single frame was ever animated. This next one is different in a way that makes it stand apart from everything else in this list. The joke itself was not aimed at any real event when it was written. The controversy only happened because something terrible occurred in the real world exactly 1 month after the episode had already aired, turning an ordinary cutaway gag into something the show's own creator would later call horrifying to watch again. The episode is called Turban Cowboy. It is the 16th episode of Season 11, making it the 203rd episode of the entire series, and it aired on Fox in the United States on March 17, 2013. It was written by Artie Johan and Sean Reese, and directed by Joe Vogt. The main plot follows Peter after he suffers an injury during a skydiving accident. While recovering in the hospital, he meets and becomes friends with a man named Mahmoud, who is Muslim. The two men get along well at first, and Peter even introduces Mahmoud to his usual group of friends back at their regular hangout spot. This friendship falls apart later in the episode once it becomes clear that Mahmoud is secretly a radical terrorist, a reveal that shifts the entire tone of the episode's back half. Alongside this main storyline, the episode includes a large number of short cutaway jokes, which had become one of the defining features of the show by this point in its run. One of these cutaways shows Peter answering questions from the real-life sports broadcaster Bob Costas, who asks him how he managed to perform so well in a race. The scene then flashes back to show Peter driving his car directly into the crowd at the Boston Marathon, striking runners as he drives through the course. Peter tells Costas, in the exaggerated, careless way the character usually delivers even his darkest lines, that he simply got into his car and drove, and that when someone was in his way, he killed them. The joke ends there, and the episode moves on to other material entirely unrelated to this scene, treating it the same way it treats most of its other cutaway gags, as a brief, disconnected moment of shock humor with no lasting connection to the main plot. At the time the episode aired, this scene did not generate any unusual level of attention. It was one dark joke among many, inside an episode already built around a much larger and more serious storyline involving a fictional terrorist plot. Nothing about the scene referenced any real event that had already happened, and nothing about it suggested the writers were trying to comment on any specific tragedy, since no tragedy involving the actual Boston Marathon existed yet at the time the episode was written, animated, or broadcast. Everything changed exactly 1 month later. On April 15, 2013, 2 bombs exploded near the finish line of the real Boston Marathon, an actual, deadly terrorist attack that killed 3 people and injured hundreds more, including 17 people who lost limbs in the explosions. This was one of the most significant and painful news events in the entire country that year, dominating national coverage for days afterward as authorities worked to identify who was responsible and why. Because the fictional cutaway joke inside Turban Cowboy happened to involve violence at the exact same event, in the exact same city, using the exact same setting, the coincidence between the joke and the real attack became impossible to ignore once people started remembering that the episode existed at all. Almost Almost immediately, a manipulated version of the episode began spreading online. Someone took the marathon cutaway scene and combined it, through editing, with a completely separate and unrelated scene from later in the same episode, one showing Peter dialing a cell phone that triggers an explosion happening off-screen, tied to the terrorist plot involving Mahmoud. By splicing these two unconnected scenes together, the edited clip created a false impression that the show had somehow predicted or even hinted at the real bombing before it happened, showing Peter both attacking runners and detonating an explosion in the same continuous sequence, even though nothing like that combination ever actually existed in the real episode. This manipulated clip did not originate randomly. According to reporting at the time, it was first pushed out publicly by the conspiracy theorist and radio host Alex Jones through his website InfoWars and his social media accounts, spreading the false idea that the cartoon had somehow foreseen the tragedy. Seth MacFarlane responded almost immediately once he became aware of the edited clip circulating online. Posting on Twitter the same day the manipulated version began spreading, MacFarlane condemned it directly, calling the edited clip currently making the rounds abhorrent and stating plainly that the real bombing had been a crime and a tragedy, with his thoughts going out to the victims of the attack. This response came from MacFarlane personally, not from a network spokesperson or a public relations team, showing how seriously he treated the situation the moment it became clear how the edited footage was being used to spread a false and hurtful idea about the show and about the real tragedy itself. Fox moved quickly as well. The network pulled Turban Cowboy from its official website, from Amazon, and from Hulu almost immediately after the bombing and the spread of the manipulated clip. A spokesperson for Fox confirmed the decision publicly, and the network also began working directly with YouTube to have copies of the manipulated, spliced-together clip removed from the platform entirely. Fox stated clearly at the time that it had no immediate plans to bring the episode back into rotation for future broadcasts, treating the situation with the same kind of caution it would apply to any piece of content that had suddenly become painfully connected to a real-world act of violence, even though the connection itself had only existed by unfortunate timing rather than any intention on the part of the people who wrote the episode. It is worth being precise about exactly what happened here, because this situation differs in an important way from every other controversy covered earlier in this story. This was not a case of the network worrying in advance about how a joke might be received before it aired, the way things played out with the episode about Judaism held back for 4 years, or the episode about abortion blocked before broadcast entirely. This was not a case of an advocacy group organizing a formal campaign against the show over its general handling of a sensitive topic, the way the letter-writing campaign in the year 2000 unfolded. This was a joke that aired completely normally, drew no unusual criticism at the time, performed well with audiences, and only became a problem after an outside event completely unrelated to the show's production turned an old joke into something painful by pure coincidence of timing and location. The episode had actually performed quite well when it originally aired back in March. It earned a rating of 2.4 among viewers between the ages of 18 and 49, a key group advertisers pay close attention to, and it brought in a total of 4.92 million viewers. This made it the most watched show that entire night across all of Fox's Sunday night animation lineup, beating out other shows airing in the same block, including The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and The Cleveland Show. Critical reviews of the episode itself, judged purely on its own merits before the bombing ever happened, were largely negative, with critics generally feeling the episode's central storyline involving Mahmoud leaned on tired and outdated ideas about how Middle Eastern characters are typically portrayed in media, feeling more like something written a decade earlier than something reflecting where the show usually stood by 2013. This means the episode was already considered one of the weaker entries of that season on its own creative merits, entirely separate from the controversy that would attach itself to the episode a month after it aired. The episode remained pulled from streaming and digital platforms for several years following the bombing. Even though it continued to exist on the show's DVD releases and occasionally appeared in cable reruns over time, it stayed missing from major streaming services for close to a decade. It was not until September of 2022 that Hulu finally restored the episode to its full library, nearly 10 years after it had first been removed. For much of that stretch, this meant Turban Cowboy sat alongside Partial Terms of Endearment, the episode covered in the very first section of this story, as one of the only pieces of Family Guy content unavailable to viewers trying to watch the entire series in order through a normal streaming subscription, even though the reasons behind each episode's absence could not have been more different from one another. There is something genuinely unusual about comparing this controversy to every other one covered so far. The episode itself never targeted any real tragedy, since no such tragedy existed yet at the moment the joke was written. The show did not intend any connection at all between its fictional cutaway gag and a real act of terrorism that would not happen until a full month later. The entire controversy exists because of an accident of timing, made worse by someone deliberately manipulating unrelated footage from the same episode to manufacture a false and misleading connection between a cartoon joke and a real tragedy that had already caused enormous suffering for real families. In a strange way, this makes Turban Cowboy less a story about a joke that went too far and more a story about how quickly old, mostly forgotten pieces of media can suddenly become dangerous once they collide with real-world events nobody could have predicted at the time they were made. This distinction matters because it shows a completely different kind of risk facing a long-running show like Family Guy compared to everything discussed earlier in this story. A show can be careful. A show can think through every joke, weigh every possible reaction, and still find itself facing a serious controversy years or even decades after an episode airs, simply because the world eventually catches up to a joke in a way nobody involved in writing it could have possibly anticipated. Every other controversy covered so far involved some level of foresight, either from the network worrying in advance, from an advocacy group building a case over time, or from a real public figure reacting directly to something written specifically with her in mind. This one involved none of that. It involved pure coincidence, followed by a deliberate act of manipulation from an outside source looking to spread a misleading and damaging idea for its own purposes. Seth MacFarlane's quick, direct response to the situation also stands apart from how the show's creative team handled some of the earlier controversies covered in this story. With the episode about Judaism, MacFarlane treated the years-long delay with a kind of dry, joking distance, referencing it publicly as something the network had once been too nervous to air. With the abortion episode, he pushed back firmly against Fox's decision, arguing directly that the network was wrong to treat that specific topic differently from others the show had already tackled. Here, facing a situation involving an actual violent tragedy and real human victims, MacFarlane did not defend the joke at all, did not argue that people were misunderstanding its intent, and did not compare it to any other example of the show's usual style of dark humor. He simply condemned the manipulated version of the clip outright and expressed sympathy for the people who had been hurt in the real attack, a response that recognized this situation carried a different kind of weight entirely compared to the usual arguments the show and its creator were used to having over its content. Looking back at this entire episode now, more than a decade after it aired, it stands as a clear example of a kind of controversy that has very little to do with anything the show's writers actually planned or intended. A satire episode about a fictional terrorist plot happened to include one throwaway joke said at a real, well-known public event. That event later became the site of an actual tragedy, and the joke that once meant almost nothing to anyone watching suddenly became something painful, something Fox felt it needed to pull from every platform it controlled, and something a dishonest source chose to twist even further into a conspiracy theory designed to suggest the show had somehow known something in advance that it had absolutely no way of knowing at all. This entire situation raises an important question about where the actual boundary sits between an episode being genuinely offensive on its own terms and an episode simply becoming painful by accident because the real world moved in a direction nobody could have predicted. Every controversy covered earlier in this story involved a joke that was, in some way, controversial from the moment it was written, whether because of who it targeted, what subject it touched, or how directly it pointed at a real living person. This episode breaks that pattern entirely. Nothing about the joke itself was unusual for the show at the time it aired. The controversy exists entirely because of what happened 1 month later, a distinction worth remembering as this list moves toward its final sections, since not every difficult moment in a long-running show's history comes from a mistake made in the writer's room. Some of them come from timing nobody could have controlled, and reactions built entirely around events that had not even happened yet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next entry in this story returns to a joke that caused controversy for the opposite reason entirely, a line that stirred outrage before the episode even aired, built entirely around a subject the writers absolutely knew would provoke a reaction the moment audiences finally heard it. Section 8, The Simpsons Guy, Season 13, 2014. The rape joke that drew a direct producer appeal. Some controversies on this list came from a network worrying quietly behind closed doors before an episode ever aired. Others came from a real-world tragedy colliding with an old joke by pure accident. This next one is different from both. This is a case where an organization saw exactly what was coming, tried to stop it directly, reached out to the actual people responsible, and still watched the joke air completely unchanged in front of one of the largest audiences the show had drawn in years. The episode at the center of this story is called The Simpsons Guy. It served as the Season 13 premiere premiere for Family Guy, airing as a full hour-long crossover between two of the longest-running animated shows on American television, Family Guy and The Simpsons. The idea for a crossover like this had been discussed for years before it finally happened, and putting it together took roughly twice as long as a normal episode, according to Family Guy showrunner Rich Appel, mainly because of the challenge of blending two very different visual styles and coordinating the schedules of two enormous voice casts at the same time. The final result brought together nearly every major character from both shows, placing Peter Griffin's family directly into the world of Springfield, home of The Simpsons, for one full hour of storytelling built around the two families crossing paths. Inside that hour-long episode sits a much smaller scene that would end up defining almost everything people remembered about the crossover once it actually aired. Early in the episode, Bart Simpson spends time with Brian and Stewie, teaching them how to make one of his classic prank phone calls to Moe's Tavern, a running joke from The Simpsons going back decades. Bart calls Moe and asks whether he has a customer with an unusual-sounding name, tricking Moe into shouting out something embarrassing to the entire bar. Everyone finds this funny, including Stewie, who decides he wants to try making his own prank call using the same basic setup. Instead of following Bart's harmless formula, Stewie calls Moe and tells him that his sister is being raped. This single line became the center of a controversy that started building before the episode had even aired. Footage from the episode, including this specific scene, was shown publicly ahead of time as part of the promotional material, building anticipation for the crossover. Once that preview footage got out, the reaction started almost immediately, well before most of the audience would ever see the full episode in its finished form. Tim Winter, president of the Parents Television Council, the same organization responsible for the 2000 letter-writing campaign covered earlier in this story, saw the preview clip and reacted strongly. He explained publicly that he had gone looking for the trailer specifically because he considered himself a longtime fan of Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, and wanted to see what the crossover looked like. Instead, he found himself deeply troubled by what he saw. He described being completely caught off guard by the rape joke appearing inside the preview, saying it genuinely disturbed him and stuck with him afterward. Rather than simply issuing a public statement criticizing the joke after the fact, Winter took a more direct approach. He wrote personally to Matt Groening, to Seth MacFarlane, and to Fox itself, asking specifically that the joke be removed before the episode aired. This detail sets this controversy apart from almost everything else covered in this story so far. Most of the other controversies involved criticism arriving after an episode had already been broadcast, forcing networks and advocacy groups to react to something the public had already seen. Here, the Parents Television Council tried to intervene before the joke ever reached its full audience, reaching out directly to the two most powerful creative figures behind both shows involved in the crossover. According to reporting on the situation at the time, Winter never received a response to his letter from either Groening or MacFarlane. Fox, when asked directly for comment on the joke by reporters covering the story, declined to say anything on the matter at all. This meant the request went essentially unanswered on every level, from the writers themselves all the way up through the network broadcasting the episode. Winter's reasoning for objecting to the joke centered on a specific argument about how comedy interacts with serious real-world issues. He explained that turning a subject like sexual assault into a punchline risks making the actual act feel less serious or less outrageous when it happens in real life, since repeated jokes about something can gradually wear down how seriously an audience takes it. He also raised a concern specifically about the age of the audience likely to be watching. Because The Simpsons had built a reputation over decades as a show that, while still edgy for its era, remained more accessible to younger viewers compared to Family Guy's more consistently adult-oriented style of humor, Winter worried that children who regularly watched The Simpsons but had little to no familiarity with Family Guy's usual tone might tune into this crossover expecting something closer to The Simpsons style of humor, only to be caught off guard by a joke this dark and specific. He pointed to recent, widely covered news events at the time, including public conversations happening around football player Ray Rice and ongoing coverage of sexual assault cases on college campuses across the country, arguing that the cultural moment made this particular joke feel even less appropriate than it might have seemed at another time. Despite this direct appeal, and despite the public criticism building in the days leading up to the broadcast, the episode aired exactly as originally written. The Simpsons Guy debuted on Fox on September 28, 2014, and the prank call scene, including Stewie's full line, remained completely intact. No edit was made, no line was cut. No public acknowledgement came from Fox, MacFarlane, or Groening explaining why the request had gone unanswered or why the decision had been made to leave the joke exactly as originally written. Seth MacFarlane did address the joke publicly, though not through any direct response to Winter or the Parents Television Council specifically. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, MacFarlane spoke about the line ahead of the backlash reaching its peak, predicting accurately that he would face criticism in the media over it. Despite expecting that reaction, he stood by the joke, describing it plainly as pretty funny when understood within the full context of the scene surrounding it. This response follows the same basic pattern seen throughout MacFarlane's defense of other controversial jokes covered earlier in this story, arguing that context and delivery matter more than the subject matter alone when judging whether a joke crosses a line that should not be crossed. It is worth being fair and precise here about what this controversy actually was and what it was not. This was not a case involving a formal government complaint, unlike some of the other Parents Television Council actions covered earlier in this story involving actual filings with the Federal Communications Commission. This was a private letter, followed by public statements from Winter explaining his concerns to reporters once his letter went unanswered. The organization used its voice and its public platform to raise the issue directly, but it did not escalate the situation into any kind of formal regulatory action, and there is no record of the government ever getting involved in this specific dispute the way it did with certain other episodes discussed elsewhere in this story. The broader public reaction beyond the Parents Television Council was mixed rather than uniformly negative. Some entertainment writers covering the crossover treated the joke as a footnote within a much larger, mostly celebrated hour of television that fans of both shows had been hoping to see for years. Others focused specifically on the joke itself as a low point in an otherwise strong episode, arguing that a crossover this widely anticipated, watched by families who might not normally sit down for Family Guy's usual style of content, deserved more caution around a subject this serious. Neither side of this argument denies what actually happened. Both agree the joke aired exactly as written, generated real controversy before and after broadcast, and represents one of the clearest documented examples in the show's history of an advocacy organization identifying a specific piece of content in advance and attempting direct, personal intervention before the episode ever reached its audience. There is an interesting piece of irony buried inside the episode itself once you look closely at how the crossover eventually addresses its own reputation for controversy. At one point during the hour, Chris Griffin makes a comment suggesting that crossovers like this one always bring out the best in each show involved, before sarcastically adding that this certainly does not appear to be some kind of marketing-driven decision rather than a purely creative one. Later in the episode, following a separate joke that draws its own wave of criticism inside the fictional story itself, Brian directly tells Peter that what just happened was not simply a joke, but a joke that specifically angered bloggers and people online. A line clearly written as commentary on how quickly modern audiences react to controversial content once it spreads across the internet. This means the show itself, within the same hour that contained the actual rape joke controversy, was already poking fun at the very idea of online outrage forming around a single controversial moment pulled out of a much longer episode. Almost as if the writers anticipated exactly the kind of reaction Stewie's joke would eventually cause once people got a full look at it. Whether this kind of self-aware commentary makes the earlier joke feel more thoughtful or simply more calculated depends heavily on how any individual viewer already feels about the show's general approach to controversy. Supporters of the show's style might see this as evidence that the writers fully understood the risk they were taking and made the choice anyway, confident the joke served a real comedic purpose worth defending publicly once the backlash arrived. Critics of the joke might see the exact same self-aware commentary as proof that the writers knew exactly how controversial the line would be and chose to include it anyway, specifically because of the attention it would generate, treating the resulting backlash as good publicity for a crossover episode that Fox had been building excitement around for months. What can be said with full confidence, based purely on the documented record, is this: a respected national organization identified a specific joke before it aired, took the unusual step of writing directly to the two most powerful creative figures behind the episode, explained its reasoning clearly and specifically, tied that reasoning to real events happening in the news at the time, and received no response and no changes in return. The joke aired exactly as originally planned, in front of one of the largest audiences the show had drawn during that entire era of its run, as part of a crossover event built around decades of anticipation from fans of two of the most successful animated shows in American television history. This particular case sits apart from almost every other controversy covered in this story because of how directly it shows the limits of outside pressure once a show has built up enough creative independence and enough of an established audience to make its own decisions with confidence. Back in the year 2000, a much younger, far more fragile Family Guy folded under a combination of weak ratings and organized pressure, leading directly to its first cancellation. By By 2014, sitting inside one of the biggest television events of its entire history, the same basic type of organized pressure from the same organization produced no visible change at all. The show that once needed a last-minute reprieve just to survive its third season had become, by this point, confident enough to receive a direct, personal appeal from a respected advocacy group and simply continue exactly as planned. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That contrast between a show once desperate enough to nearly disappear entirely and a show later secure enough to ignore direct appeals from the very same kind of organization sets up one final question worth asking about this entire history. If controversy alone was never quite enough to stop the show once it built up real success, the only thing that ever did manage to fully block a piece of content came down to one very specific kind of pressure, arriving from inside the network itself, tied directly to money and advertisers rather than public outrage of any kind. Section 9. The PTC's Formal FCC Indecency Complaints, 2010, 2013, 2015. This next part of the story moves into a different kind of action entirely, one that goes beyond simply complaining to the show or to Fox. This is about the Parents Television Council taking its objections one step further, straight to the government agency that actually has the power to punish television networks for content it considers indecent. The agency in question is called the Federal Communications Commission, usually shortened to the FCC. This is a government organization that oversees television and radio broadcasting across the entire country. Part of its job involves handling complaints from the public about content that might break rules around indecency, meaning material considered too sexual, too vulgar, or otherwise inappropriate for the times and channels it aired on. When enough formal complaints pile up around a specific show or episode, the FCC has the power to investigate, and in some cases, it can issue fines or other penalties against the network responsible for airing the material. Filing a complaint with the FCC is a much bigger step than simply writing an angry letter to a network, because it involves an actual government body with real legal authority, rather than just public pressure or bad press. The Parents Television Council did not go straight to the FCC when it first started criticizing Family Guy back in the show's earliest years. For a long stretch of the show's history, most of the organization's actions looked like the ones covered earlier in this story. Things like public statements, worst show of the week rankings, and the direct letter writing campaign back in the year 2000. Over time, as the show continued running and continued pushing its content further, the organization began taking the more serious step of filing official complaints directly with the FCC, asking the government to formally review specific episodes for indecency. The first major example of this happened in 2010, tied to the show's 150th episode called Brian and Stewie. The complaint centered on a stretch of the episode filled with jokes about bodily functions and other crude material that the organization considered inappropriate for broadcast television. Tim Winter, the president of the Parents Television Council, spoke publicly about this specific episode in a way that captured exactly how seriously the organization took the situation. He stated that it seemed as though Family Guy's creator had carefully studied the legal definition of broadcast indecency and then set out to break that rule as directly and as literally as possible. This comment reflects an important part of the argument the organization had been building for years by this point. The idea that the show was not accidentally crossing lines through careless writing, but was intentionally testing exactly how far it could push its content while still staying inside the boundaries the law allowed. The next major formal complaint came a few years later, in November of 2013, tied to an episode called A Fistful of Meg. This complaint was filed just 5 days after the episode actually aired, showing how quickly the organization moved once it decided a specific episode deserved this level of formal action. The complaint pointed to several different types of content inside the episode that the organization considered lewd or inappropriate, including sexual material and jokes touching on subjects like child abuse and exploitation, along with jokes built around sexual ideas tied to food. The complaint also raised concerns about the episode's main plot, which centered on a boy at school bullying and physically attacking one of his female classmates, a storyline the organization felt crossed a line beyond the show's usual style of shock humor. The third documented example of this pattern happened in February of 2015, tied to an episode called Quagmire's Mom. This complaint focused specifically on sexually explicit dialogue throughout the episode, along with jokes touching on the subject of statutory rape, meaning sexual activity involving someone under the legal age of consent. The specific plot point that drew the complaint involved the character Quagmire having a sexual encounter with a teenage girl, only learning her actual age after the encounter had already happened. The Parents Television Council filed this complaint specifically calling for people to submit their own indecency reports to the FCC FCC over the episode, turning this into a more organized public push rather than simply a single letter sent quietly on the organization's own behalf. Looking at these three specific complaints together, spread out across 2010, 2013, and 2015, a clear pattern starts to form. Each one targeted a different specific episode. Each one focused on a different type of content, ranging from crude bodily humor to violent bullying to jokes touching on serious topics like child exploitation and statutory rape. And each one represents a formal, documented action taken directly with a government agency rather than simply another public statement aimed at the show or at Fox. It is important to be precise here about what these complaints actually accomplished, since filing a complaint with the FCC does not automatically mean the government agrees with it or takes action against the network involved. The historical record shows these three complaints being filed as documented events, but it does not show the FCC issuing any major fines or punishments against Fox specifically tied to these three episodes as a direct result of the complaints. This is an important distinction. The Parents Television Council used its position to formally push these complaints into the government's hands, using its national platform to encourage its supporters to file their own individual complaints as well, adding real pressure to the situation. But formally filing a complaint and successfully getting the government to punish a network over that complaint are two very different things, and the available public record does not show these three specific complaints resulting in confirmed FCC fines against Fox. This entire pattern connects directly back to the very beginning of this story, all the way back to the year 2000, when the same organization first launched its letter-writing campaign urging Fox to cancel the show entirely. Over more than a decade, the organization's approach clearly evolved and grew more sophisticated. What started as a public letter-writing push aimed simply at convincing a network to make a business decision eventually grew into a much more structured, ongoing strategy involving specific, documented complaints filed directly with a government regulatory agency, each one built around a specific episode, a specific type of content, and a specific date tied to when the complaint was formally submitted. The organization's efforts throughout this stretch of years were not limited only to these three formal FCC complaints. According to its own public statements over the years, the Parents Television Council named Family Guy the worst television show of the week more than 40 separate times across the full length of the show's run, a number that shows just how consistently this one organization kept returning to this one specific series, year after year, long after most of the show's earliest controversies had already faded from public memory. The organization also placed the show on its official worst primetime shows for family viewing lists in the years 2000, 2005, and 2006, spreading its criticism out across nearly the entire first decade of the show's existence rather than focusing only on a handful of isolated incidents. Seth MacFarlane has spoken publicly and bluntly about his feelings toward the Parents Television Council on more than one occasion over the years. In an interview with a magazine called The Advocate back in 2008, he compared receiving criticism from the organization to receiving praise from history's most notorious dictator, describing the people running it in extremely harsh terms, and specifically criticizing what he saw as a contradiction between the organization presenting itself as focused on positive Christian values while spending nearly all of its time and energy attacking other people's work. This kind of direct public response shows just how personal this ongoing fight had become by this point, stretching far beyond a simple disagreement over where to draw the line on a handful of individual jokes and turning instead into a long-running, deeply personal rivalry between the show's creator and the organization that had spent well over a decade trying to shut the show down entirely. What makes this specific chapter of the story different from almost everything else covered earlier is the sheer amount of documented, dated, official record behind it. This is not a case built on interviews given years after the fact, or general descriptions of ongoing tension between a show and its critics. These are three specific complaints, filed on three specific dates, aimed at three specific episodes, each one clearly explained in terms of exactly what content triggered the complaint in the first place. Taken together, they show a pattern of sustained, organized, and increasingly formal pressure against the show, stretching from a simple letter-writing campaign in the year 2000 all the way through official government complaints filed as recently as 2015, spanning nearly the entire history of the series up to that point. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises one final question worth sitting with as this story moves toward its close. If more than a decade of organized pressure, formal government complaints, direct personal appeals, and national controversies involving real public figures were never quite enough to bring the show down permanently after its early years, what does that say about the actual difference between controversy that generates headlines storylines and controversy that genuinely threatens a show's survival? The answer to that question brings this entire story back to where it started, and back to the one single force that has proven, again and again throughout the show's history, to matter more than any single joke, any single complaint, or any single angry public figure ever could. Section 10. Canceled twice. How low ratings, not just content, nearly ended the show for good. This final part of the story steps back from any single joke entirely and looks instead at the two moments that came closest to ending Family Guy completely. Moments driven almost entirely by simple business numbers rather than outrage over any specific piece of writing. The show first went on the air on January 31st, 1999, debuting right after that year's Super Bowl, a placement that handed it an enormous first audience simply because of how many people were already watching television that night. Season 1 held on to a fairly strong position in the schedule, airing on Sunday nights alongside other already popular Fox shows. That early strength did not last. When Season 2 began, Fox moved the show to Thursday nights, placing it directly against Frasier, a long-running and well-loved network sitcom that already had a large, loyal audience of its own. Competing against an established hit like that put immediate pressure on the new show's numbers, and the ratings began sliding almost right away. Later that same season, the show moved again, this time landing on Tuesday nights opposite Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, one of the biggest television phenomena in the entire country at that specific moment in history. During this stretch, Family Guy landed at number 114 in the Nielsen ratings, the system television networks use to measure how many households are tuning into a given show. Around 6.3 million households watched during one especially telling week, a number that looked weak compared to what shows in similarly competitive time slots were pulling in that same era. By May of 2000, with ratings struggling and the show bouncing between different nights and time slots with little warning, Fox made the decision to cancel Family Guy after its second season. As covered earlier in this story, this cancellation happened during the exact same window of time that the Parents Television Council launched its organized letter-writing campaign urging Fox to end the show for good. Fox's own public reasoning pointed toward the show's weak performance against much stronger competition rather than any direct response to outside pressure, though both forces were clearly present at the very same moment. What happened next surprised almost everyone paying attention. On July 24, 2000, only about 2 months after the cancellation was announced, Fox reversed its decision and ordered 13 new episodes, giving the show a third season. This kind of quick reversal rarely happens in television, since networks usually only walk back a cancellation once something changes their thinking in a very short window of time. Family Guy returned to the air on November 8, 2001, but the difficult scheduling continued. The show landed on Thursday nights at 8 o'clock, putting it directly against two of the biggest shows on all of television at that time, Survivor and Friends. Survivor was riding the massive wave of the reality television boom, sweeping the entire industry, while Friends remained one of the most watched sitcoms in the country year after year. Being placed against either show alone would have been difficult. Facing both at the same time, in the same hour, made survival even harder. The ratings during this third season suffered just as badly as before, and Fox tried shuffling the show around the schedule again, hoping a different time slot might finally help it find its footing. According to reporting from that period, this constant shifting around the schedule ended up making the problem worse rather than better, since audiences already struggling to find the show at a consistent time became even less likely to build a regular habit of watching once the day and hour kept changing under them. By May 15, 2002, when Fox revealed its full lineup for the upcoming fall season, Family Guy was completely absent from the list. The show had been canceled for a second time, and this time it felt far more permanent than the first. One episode near the end of Season 3 was left completely unaired when the cancellation took effect, sitting unfinished and unreleased for well over a year before eventually reaching an audience through Adult Swim rather than through Fox itself. What happened after this second cancellation is one of the most unusual comeback stories in the entire history of American television. Fox tried selling the rerun rights to the show to other networks and found almost no interest at all. Eventually, according to the president of 20th Century Fox Television at the time, the rights were picked up by Cartoon Network for airing on its late-night Adult Swim block, described as being sold almost for free given how little value anyone placed on the show at that point. Nobody expected what happened next. Family Guy became Adult Swim's highest-rated program, and according to reporting from Entertainment Weekly, its viewership grew by 239% once it found this new home. Steve Feldstein, a former Fox Home Entertainment executive, later explained to the New York Times that there had been a real fan base for the show quietly waiting in the background the entire time, one that grew even larger once new viewers discovered the show through these reruns. At almost the exact same time, the show's DVD sales began climbing growing at a pace nobody at Fox had anticipated. The first and second season episodes were released together as a DVD set called Family Guy Volume 1 in April of 2003. This release ended up selling around 2.2 million copies, making it the best-selling television DVD of that entire year and the second highest-selling television DVD ever made up to that point, trailing only the first season of Comedy Central's Chappelle's Show. The third season DVD release performed strongly as well, selling more than 1 million copies of its own. Altogether, DVD sales for the show eventually reached roughly 3 million copies, a number far too large for Fox executives to keep ignoring. Gail Berman, who served as president of Fox at the time, later spoke publicly about how difficult the original decision to cancel the show had actually been for her personally, and how relieved she felt once the numbers finally justified bringing it back. In 2004, Fox made the decision to revive Family Guy, ordering 35 new episodes, marking the very first time in television history that a canceled show had been brought back specifically because of strong DVD sales, rather than any other traditional reason networks typically use to revive old programming. Season 4 premiered on May 1st, 2005, this time placed in a much safer time slot on Sunday nights, right after The Simpsons, one of the most reliable and successful shows on the entire network. The show has continued airing new episodes without interruption ever since that return, now stretching across more than 20 seasons and over 400 total episodes. It is worth being completely clear about what this part of the story actually shows, especially compared to every other section covered earlier. Nothing about these two cancellations involved a single controversial joke, a specific offensive scene, or a targeted complaint about the show's content. Both cancellations came down to simple business math, a young show consistently losing ratings battles against some of the biggest hits in television history, night after night, across 3 completely different seasons and 4 completely different competing shows. The revival that followed came down to equally simple business math working in the opposite direction, a show quietly building a passionate audience through reruns and DVD sales until the numbers became too large for anyone at the network to ignore any longer. This stands in sharp contrast to every controversy covered throughout the rest of this story. The abortion episode was blocked by a business decision tied to advertiser fear during a weak economy. The episode about Judaism was held back over concern about how a joke might be misread. The AIDS musical number and the Down syndrome joke both drew real public anger without ever threatening the show's place on the air. The Boston Marathon cutaway became a problem only because of an outside tragedy occurring after the fact. The rape joke inside the Simpsons crossover survived a direct appeal from a national advocacy group without any changes at all, and the formal FCC complaints filed in 2010, 2013, and 2015 never resulted in confirmed government penalties against the network. None of these moments, no matter how loud the backlash or how serious the subject matter, ever came close to ending the show the way 2 simple, unglamorous ratings collapses did back in 2000 and 2002. This is the real, complete picture sitting underneath the entire history explored across this video. A show known today for constantly testing the limits of what television can get away with joking about actually came closest to disappearing forever, not because of anything it said, but because of time slots, competing shows, and Nielsen numbers that had nothing to do with controversy at all. Every fight over a specific joke, every formal complaint, every angry public figure, and every network decision to block a single episode happened only because the show survived those 2 early, quiet, purely business-driven cancellations first. Without the reruns on Adult Swim, and without 3 million DVDs sold by fans who found the show almost by accident, none of the other 9 stories in this video would exist at all, because there would have been no show left standing to create any of them. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.